Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a chance to refill those coffee mugs and grab a snack because we have another great session ready for you. Please welcome Saucy Perry, who's going to present Make Spring Home, Spring Customization and Extensibility.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome to my session, Make Spring Home. Today, we are going to bring some spring to our home via customization and extensibility. I work for Cardinal Health. Cardinal Health is one of the largest healthcare company, and it is also one of highest revenue generating company in the United States. And we provide medical supplies to hospitals, pharmacies, patients, labs, and almost everything. Here is my disclaimer. And coming to the agenda, I'm going to quickly go over why am I doing this presentation? Why is this very important? And this is going to be very dense, demo-oriented presentation with some live coding, and we will cover certain things to watch out. Now, why am I doing this presentation? Every organization in some capacity would have certain common functionality and argue-wide cross-cutting concerns that you want to do it in a certain way across all product lines and business units. Like, for example, at Cardinal Health, we all the time deal with protected healthcare information in all our B2B, B2C commerce situations. And we want to deal with them in a very specific way carefully. And it's not easy to impose on every developer and every commit. Or probably sometimes you would have certain algorithms that are your secret sauce, your intellectual property that you want to abstract from the developers for whatever reasons, and still want to provide them to the developer to be able to consume. And even better, you may want to manage the dependencies for them, and you want to auto-configure them. So now you may be thinking, aren't these the same goals that Spring.io already talks about? Then you are exactly right. Spring.io already talks about these things, and they already resolved them using various techniques like opinionation, and they have starters and a lot of techniques. Now, that's exactly why I'm talking about Spring's extensibility and customization aspects. What that means is that we could Springify our code and inherit their goodness and resolve our problems without reinventing the wheel. Then there are many aspects in the Spring and Spring Cloud space that can be customized. But today, particularly, I'm going to talk about custom starters. And then once you have the custom starters, now comes the second problem, the developer experience. How will you provide an experience to the developers in such a way that these can be easily consumed and the developers know that these are existing? We are going to talk about it, and then we are going to talk about some security aspects. And then watch out things, certain things to watch out. Now, quickly, let's get to the custom starters. And I'm going to demonstrate this using Alexa Spring Boot Starter. Now, what is a Spring Boot Starter and why do we need that? Usually, Spring Boot Starter is a blank jar, and its whole purpose is to bring things together, scaffold things together, such as the custom libraries and third-party dependencies, and also, most importantly, auto-configure them for the developers. And it can also expose certain configurations so the starter will become extensible. That's the main purpose. But should it be always a blank jar? If your auto configurations are very straightforward and simple, then you don't have to make them blank. You could club them together, which is what I'm going to do. Coming to my Alexa Spring Boot Starter, though, it's a starter I created if you want to create a custom skill as a Spring Boot based web service. Now let's quickly dive into the code. Now, before getting into the code, why Alexa Spring Boot Starter? That's because it's fun. It's very fun to build Alexa skills. Secondly, I created this Spring Boot kind of project many years ago. And I think a year ago, I started the open source community under Apache v2 license. And then I thought I'll reuse this for this purpose because it's convenient. Now let's see the details of how you make these starters. The first thing is your dependencies. Now let me increase the font. And I have a couple of dependencies here. The first thing is the configuration processor. This is something to do with your properties, where you get the hints and auto completion aspects. We will see how that happens. And then the next thing is auto configure processor. This is optional, but very important because it improves the startup times. It improves it by at compile time, annotation processing and creating some metadata. And if that is present, it eagerly filters the auto configurations as I documented there. So that's important, although optional. And then comes your third-party dependencies. Here in my case, I have only one third-party dependency, which is Ask SDK. This is Amazon's second generation Java SDK. They have first generation. The difference is this is more modular and plug-in, plug-out kind of a thing, more pluggable, your intents. When I say intents, now I think let me also explain what is an Alexa skill. Alexa skill, simply put together, itself is an application which is created for an intended specific purpose, which can take certain commands. That's what are known as intents, called as intents by Amazon. And this application is known as Alexa skill. That's the name that Amazon came up with. Now, let's see the auto configuration aspects. The first thing. And how does a starter know how to auto configure? And it's via Spring Factories. Here I have a class. You can have list of classes. I end up having only one auto configuration that I listed here. Now let's see what it entails. The first thing, again, in the auto configuration is to tell when to auto configure. There are multiple ways of making these opinions that Spring provided. The most famous one is using the class path. Inspect the class path, and then based on the class path and what you have on the class path, you make opinions. So I am looking at skill servlet, which is part of the SDK. Now, the second thing I'm doing here is expose a endpoint where all these requests can be posted via a configurable URI mapping. And then I create a skill and inject all the request handlers, that's the intent handlers, automatically. And this another thing that I do here is also configure the skill ID, which is a unique ID that Amazon provides. What this means is that every time an intent comes into, it validates the application ID that is in the intent is matching the application ID of the skill, and only the intended ones will be handled by it. It's more of security thing. And how does it figures out all intent handlers? Using the Spring constructor injection. It gathers all Spring components of type generic handlers and it injects them. Now, so all developer need to do is to keep creating these request handlers via the interface request handler and mark them as Spring components. That's all they have to do. Now, I have some sample intent handlers which can be overridden and more intent handlers can be created. For example, let's see the help intent handler. So it says what is the intent it can handle and how it handles the implementation. Now that brings to the last aspect, that's properties. Now, if you see, this is made extensible via the properties. Now, the developers have to know what are the properties available and the default values and how to use them and auto completion. So if you see that there is some Java documentation here, it serves a very specific purpose. So the configuration processor goes through this Java documentation and it generates metadata that can be used to provide this. Now, there is another way of doing it is doing it by manually creating it, but you don't want to do that. However, you may have special situations and complex configuration, like you want to tell the data type of your properties. Sometimes it could be a list, map, and you want to provide default values. In such situations, you could also provide additional properties like I did. So I provided some default values and such. And then the processor knows to merge them and create an effective one. That's how it figures out the auto completion and such. Now, because they are not backward compatible, I ended up creating another Spring Boot starter for generation 0. The difference is that it's not pluggable. Everything happens via its speechlet interface, and then everything happens via one method on intent. When you override, you have to manually figure out what the intent is and provide the implementation. Now that we created these Spring Boot starters, they are Maven projects, but it could as well be Gradle. The second thing, next thing is, because it's open source, I created a Sauna type. I need that so I can publish. Now I Maven which gives me access to the Nexus repository. Via my Maven install, I installed that into the Sauna type Nexus repository, and then do validations. It checks if I have sources, Java doc, and such things. And then at the time I publish to the central repository, it requires me to sign these jars using PGP signature, which I did. So now they are available in the central repository. So the most important thing to look here is the artifact with the extension POM. Whether or not it is a blank jar, this is the building block that is available. And now they are available in Maven Central and a couple of other Maven repositories. Now that brings down to the next part of my demo. So how do we create the developer experience, right? So where do you think all the Spring Boot developers typically land to create Spring Boot projects? Where does all roads of the Spring Boot developers lead to? Any guesses? It's nothing but Spring Initializer. And notice that it is Spring Initializer without E. For some reason, that's the project name. Now let's see what it is and how to do that. What is Spring Initializer? It's the second best place on the intranet. We will see what is the first place, best place towards the end if we have time. Now why custom initializer? Like I said, this can, if you have your starters, custom starters and third-party libraries, they are not going to be available in start.spring.io. You may want to create your own initializer and make them available. And sometimes you may have some network firewall rules and you are behind them, you cannot even reach start.spring.io. So that's why you may want to create your initializer. Now let's see. Let me close all the files that we already looked at and go to the Spring Initializer. To create the basic Spring Initializer is the easiest thing. You don't have to write anything, but include few dependencies. One of them is Spring Starter Web, so it will expose automatically a REST endpoint. And then the initializer generator. That's all you need. And let's start this and see what happens. And it's running on 8090. Let's see what that gets. Here is my Postman. So it exposes, like I said, a endpoint, and then it provides the ALPs, profile semantics. And this is enough for you to create the start.spring.io kind of a UI. And it is enough for you to actually use it in your application, IDE. Let's see how that looks like. And it's 90. So you have this readily available. Notice that you don't see all the versions of Spring Boot. That's because prior to, right now it's 0.9, prior to 0.9. Sure. Thank you. So the Spring Boot 0.8 automatically goes to the spring.io and get the live information of the Spring Boot versions. However, in 0.9, you have to define a bean specifically to make that happen. And that also means that you have to have your cache manager to cache this. So now, plus you don't have a UI here. So the other way of doing it is by forking the start.spring.io and customize it, which is what I did also. And it's running on my 8080. Now let's see what that brings. This is the regular spring.io. Now let me go to localhost 8080. So this is the customized one. And most important thing now is this. Now, if I see my libraries are available, and this happens via something called BOM bill of material, and that is managed via your properties file. Now, that brings us to the next portion, to build a sample skill. Now, let's put these two things together, the starter and the initializer, and do some coding. Let's create a Spring initializer project. And now, okay, I'm going 8080. Notice that now you see all the versions, because now it's pulling from Spring.io metadata. And I need Spring Web, and my libraries are available. And the good thing is it also exposes the documentation. This is all happening via the properties BOM, bill of material. And you can provide the documentation that probably is available. And finish. Now let's see the Alexa hello and the properties. Now let's give a name, spring.application.name. I'm going to call that Alexa hello. And then port, maybe I'll run it on 8081. Now see the help that I was talking about. So all the properties came here, and it tells what they mean and what the default values are and so on. Now to make it faster, because we don't have enough time, I created my shortcut to get the properties here. And this is the application ID that Amazon provides when you register your skill. And now let's customize a bit. Welcome Spring One. And maybe hello Spring One. And then one more thing that we need to do is simply create a class. And I call that hello world speechlet. And this is because I created my custom template, so it helped me with the coding. Now let's customize a little bit here too. And let's see, we want to handle the stop intent. I'm using the Janzira version because it's easy instead of creating multiple handlers. Now, the starter method, this is coming from starter. When it gets a response, it can also take a Boolean value as an input. When supplied as true, when I say goodbye or stop, it's going to close the session and it cleans certain things from the session. Now let's start this. Okay. Now it started on 8081. Now, Amazon Alexa Developer Console would not know anything about my local host. So I'm going to make use of ngrok to expose my 8081. Now that gives me, I'll pick the HTTPS URL and go back to my browser. And here I have my Alexa skills. This is my skill that I created, an Alexa skill. And go to the endpoint and replace it with what I have and save it. And let's give a quick test.
Welcome Spring One.
So here I have my friend Echo Dot of type AVS. Her name is Alexa. Let's see. Alexa, cardinal hello.
Welcome Spring 1.
Help.
Help sample Spring Boot hello.
Goodbye.
Help sample Spring Boot hello.
Bye. So as you can see, it's all done so quickly, maybe 5 minutes or so. Now that brings to the next portion of the demo, account linking. What is account linking? Account linking is this is where the Spring Security, power of Spring Security comes into picture. The skill that I built is the super simple skill anybody can invoke, right? But in the real life situations, it's not like that. For example, let's say Uber is building a skill and it has to deploy the car to the customer and it has to link it to the customer so it can charge the customer and such, right? So that means the customer has to be authenticated, authorized, and all that. That's what is the account linking all about. Now let's see how that happens. But before I get into the technical details, for this part of the demo, I want to first demo actually, and then go into the code and technical details. So then it will make more sense. For that, I have, let me stop my 8081. And I think I have my Alexa OMS. So I have an Alexa OMS application that I created and it's running already. Now let me go back to my ngrok, stop this, and then now expose my 8082. And pick the HTTPS URL as usual. And go to the other skill. I call that edge bar carders. And then the endpoint. Now we have to do something more special here. Because we are doing account linking, I have to tell where my authorization endpoint is. And where can it get a JART token. And it expects me to put my client password, which I'm going to input. And save. Now, let's go to test, and it should fail. On the first instance, and then it should work. Let's go to test one more time. Let's see the enable skill. So this is the Alexa Amazon console where you register your device and such. Now let's see what happens here when I click enable. And this is running right in my Alexa OMS application. And I think and I would say authorize, and it thinks it's successfully linked. Now, for some reason, this is not loading, but let's test with the real device. Now it thinks at least it account linked. Now let's see. Alexa, Edge Park Supplies.
Welcome Cardinal Edge Park Supplies. This is Alexa. I can help tracking your orders.
Alexa, help.
Using Edge Park order tracking skill, you can find your order status, order details, and get first or last few orders. Maximum up to 5.
Alexa,
For example,
Alexa, get me top 10 orders.
I am sorry. Valid number of orders I can get you should be between 1 and 5. You asked me for invalid number 10.
Alexa, get me top 2 orders.
Order number 555. Placed on March 1st, 2017 by Saucy. Order number 568. Placed on February 28th, 2017 by Saucy.
Alexa, find the order status of 568.
Order status pending. This order is waiting for endurance verification.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
So as you can see, it did not pick 789 because that belongs to a different customer. It picked the customer that is linked to. Now let's go to the technical details. So this is backed by my MySQL sample database that I created. Back to my presentation. So what just happened? When I clicked the account linking enable the skill, the first thing it did is to go to the authorization endpoint that I configured, which is part of my application. That's the authorization server. I copied this diagram right from Amazon Alexa dev. It's more, in my opinion, it's more appropriate to say Alexa service is directing to login page. Instead, it should say authorization URL, because authorization URL, authorization server is what determines that which auth code flow grant type it is coming from. So the service actually asks for auth code flow, and then it determines, because it is auth code, it knows to which login page to direct to. Alexa service does not know where the login page is. My application, my authorization server knows. So it goes to the login page. Typically in real life situation, it would be your it could be your identity provider like Okta or Keycloak. That could also, it could do authentication, and it also has capabilities to support the OpenID Connect, OAuth 2, and authorization server capabilities. So it goes there, it gets to the login page, and the user enters ID password. Then the authorization server, my application in this case, will generate something called auth code, and the auth code is what gets sent back to Alexa service. Now the Alexa service takes that, and it then sends along with the auth code, it sends the client ID and password that I configured, and a couple of other things like state and all. And that gets sent again back to authorization server, and it asks for the token in exchange of the auth code, which is the typical auth code grant type in OAuth 2. And then it takes the auth code and then provides a JWT token, which is signed. It can be signed asymmetrically or symmetrically, and in my case, I did the asymmetrical signed. I did the asymmetrical way. Now, notice that in the OAuth 2 auth code flow, it's a bearer token. It's not opaque. Now that token gets to the Alexa service, and it takes the token, and the token is presented back to the resource server, and resource server takes it and then goes back to the authorization server to validate. Once that is validated using the public private key mechanism, it when it is valid, it recognizes the resource owner is the correct resource owner. It provides the response. So many things happened. It looks so complex, right? Now let's see the code, and then you may change your opinion about the complexity with Spring Security. Now let's close all these things and see what it entails. So now I have again two applications, Alexa OMS and the Order Tracker. Both are doing the same things. One is created before Spring Security 5.3, and the other one is after Spring 5.3. Before 5.3, all OAuth 2 capabilities are available via OAuth 2 Spring Starter. Which includes things that you need and things that you don't need most commonly, like the authorization server. You don't typically build your authorization server, but 5.3 took that away and made it into the open source community. It made it as an open source community project, which was released, I think, a week or 2 weeks ago. Now, so that's why I ended up having both versions. Now let's see the configuration in both cases. So I have the first thing, web security. For my login, it also is a web application, right? So this is the typical Spring Web MVC. Oh, so let me make it little visible. So this is a typical configuration that you have for the web security. As you can see, enable web security. Now I have so enable, that's the resource. Let's see the authorization server. It's just one annotation that makes this thing host a authorization server and automatically expose the authorize and the token and all those endpoints. Now, all I had to do is to create a self-signed certificate for the asymmetric key signing and stuff. That's all I had to do. And now I have a resource server configuration. Now that's the difference between 5.3 and prior to 5.3. I ended up having a resource server configuration, which is via the resource server annotation, but whereas in this configuration, actually, you don't have, it's not two parts, it's just one. Everything, the web and resource server are clubbed together. And this is one extra annotation that gets you the resource server capabilities. So now that is done so easily with very less code. Now let's see the implementation aspects of the speechlet. This is all, the controller is a simple controller, login controller, and this is all JPA, the regular standard JPA, nothing special. Now the speechlet. Now here, I hope you can see, I think I maximized it. It decodes the JWT token and it gets the principal, which is the user ID. And now let's see how the token look like. I saved a token from my previous session and it looks something like this. And these claims can be enhanced and provide more roles and authorizations for authorization purposes. And these are the scope and the encryption. This is how typically a JWT token, bearer token would look like. So that's pretty much about, now rest all is the implementation that's happening in my service, which is nothing but using the JPA, go to the database, and it creates the SSML, speech synthesis markup language. That's what it is doing. It goes to the database, it gets the response, and it creates these SSML responses. So it tells how much to break and how to pronounce and so on and so forth. And now let's see what I have in the presentation next. So yeah, we are almost getting there. Before we end, there are certain things to watch out. Now, don't let LS take over you, meaning don't go about creating everything as a starter. So rather what you want to do is to group all these functional aspects in a logical way and then make a starter. Otherwise, you will end up having so many starters that you almost would need a starter to manage starters and conflicting dependencies, which you have to be aware. And the even more important thing is this, the standards and naming conventions. When you are creating a third-party starter, you have to be very careful about how you name them, like how you name your starter, how you name your properties and the namespace aspects. Otherwise, you will pay the price sooner or later because Spring can make changes in such a way that it can break these things tomorrow. If you are an open source project, it is easy because thousands of people are watching. Most importantly, Spring team is watching. If you don't believe me, I'll show you the proof. So here, in December, as you can notice, it's midnight. So I published just before the midnight these starters with a different namespace and stuff. And then, as you can see, Stephen Nicole immediately pointed within half an hour or maybe less than an hour with issues and bugs that I had to fix. So you have to pay closer attention to the documentation. It has clear documentation as to how you name them, what are the standards, strict standards. Now that brings to some links I provided here and my source code and blog documentation for these things. And then I also included some more sessions that are relevant and related where they're talking about more of these customization aspects. And then the session cannot be ended without thanking these three individuals. The first and foremost is Jim Shingler. Most of these ideas comes with discussions and informal, casual conversations with him, and so many things pop up. And Ralph Meira, VMware, and Brian Haldren, my friend at LeanDog, both of them, thank you so much for lending your ear before this presentation, and they are the ones provided a whole lot of feedback into it. And finally, spring has sprung. It's Q&A time. I think we have some time. If we don't have time, there is a special Slack channel that is open. I'm going to log in there, and we have some more time, like at least 15-20 minutes, to go over anything more in-depth and talk about. And in fact, this is a slide that my daughter, 7-year-old, came up with, because when she saw Nature Cat and Hal bought some spring to home. So this slide is made by her. And with that, I would conclude my presentation, and let's see if the Slack channel has anything, or if my time is up.
All right, thanks, Sasi. I really enjoyed hearing how to. Oh, you have more time. Yeah.
Okay, so I can go to the Slack and then see if there are any questions. Okay. Let's get to, let's see if there are any questions popping up. Sure. So how do I go to my Slack channel to see if there are any questions popped up?
All right. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Sasi. Yeah, you're going to continue the Q&A session over in a separate Zoom channel. So the link to that is on the breakout page on the website. So if you want to go continue the discussion, that's where to go. But thanks. That was really great. I enjoyed hearing how to customize and extend Spring. And obviously, I'm a big Alexa fan. And so doing it in the context of an Alexa skill is amazing. So head on over to keep the discussion going. Head on over to the Q&A session. And I think we'll start up again in about 20 minutes. So hope to see you then.